Okay, recording. Admitting. Hi, Mackenzie.
Hi.
Hey, so we have we have the full panel to present today, and we're just going to go ahead and record the meeting and go forward as we were. We just won't have as many questions at the end as we might have expected previously. So, okay, hello and good afternoon. On behalf of the Oregon Project Management Advisory Board, welcome to our Project Management User Group presentation of the month. My name is Amy Croucher, your coordinator for 2023, and will be facilitating our meeting today. We'd like to start with a few housekeeping items for those not on the panel. Please mute your phone or PC if not speaking to help reduce any background noise. If you're not speaking, and you are encouraged to remain off camera, as you may have noticed, this meeting is being recorded. If you have any questions, please wait until the end of the presentation by raising your hand. And I'm happy to announce we are currently recruiting for a position on the statewide Project Management Advisory Board. A link to the description of the board is in the chat on the website. And once you get to the website, scroll down to the links on the bottom of the page and select the link to joining the board. Also, if you're interested in the business analyst processes, the Business Analyst Networking Group meets the third Wednesday on months in which the Project Management Advisory Board does not meet. So I've placed a link to their website in the chat, and you may select that to learn more about their group. This meeting will be recorded, and a link to the meeting and resources will be shared shortly after today's session and posted on the DAS YouTube channel. You will also find the slides in the meeting invitation. You're welcome to share with your other colleagues and encouraged to spread the word on your PMUG Wednesday sessions. Okay, without further ado, I'll go ahead and start sharing the presentation. And it's PowerPoint, and we'll get started here. One moment, I'm gonna go ahead and go off camera. And so today, in response to a PMUG subject suggestion, a panel of state staff will discuss adapting Agile project management practices in a state waterfall-centric environment. And here are some definitions of Agile and Waterfall. Agile is a way to manage a project by breaking it up into several phases. It involves constant collaboration with stakeholders and continuous improvement at every stage. Waterfall is a project management approach that emphasizes a linear progression from beginning to end of the project. There are different Agile approaches. Kanban is a simple visual means of managing projects that enables teams to see the progress so far and what comes up next. Kanban projects are primarily managed through a Kanban board, which segments tasks into 3 columns: to do, doing, and done. Scrum is similar to a Kanban in many ways. Scrum typically uses a Scrum board similar to a Kanban board and groups tasks into columns based on progress. Unlike Kanban, Scrum focuses on breaking a project down into sprints and only planning and managing one sprint at a time. Scrum also has unique project roles. Scrum Master and Product Owner are a couple of them. There's also extreme programming, or XP, which focuses on continuous development and customer delivery and uses intervals or sprints similar to Scrum. And finally, lean development is an application of lean principles to software development as a way to minimize waste and maximize value. Here are some pros and cons of Agile. One moment here. Apologies. Some pros for Agile project management methodology are Agile promotes some of the best practices found in development environments. Some of the risk in a project should be reduced as the output of developers is reviewed early and constantly during development. When projects are genuinely new, they usually require creativity. Requirements can then emerge as understanding matures and grows. Flexibility can be higher than traditional methods, although this is not guaranteed. Changes, such as in prioritization, can be introduced at almost any stage. And encourages or requires frequent communication between developers and those who will ultimately accept and use the deliverable. This should pay major dividends when effective. For example, feedback can be incorporated into future iterations as increments are delivered and reviewed by users or a product owner or both. False assumptions made by developers can be recognized very early, reducing impact. Agile gives us continual opportunities to learn via this feedback. Some cons for Agile are Agile is simple to understand in principle, but hard to do well in practice. It requires real commitment, and first attempts are not likely to go very well. It is less predictable what will be delivered at the end. Agile requires high levels of collaboration and very regular communication between developers and users. This is always desirable, but may not always be feasible and requires continual commitment and time from the business and developers. Agile is very intensive for both developers and users. There can be reasons that may prevent this. For example, if developers work on multiple projects at one time. The only downside to the opportunities to learn is that people have got to be prepared to do it. Next, here are some pros and cons of waterfall methodology. On well-managed projects, waterfall may provide more confidence of what will finally be delivered earlier in the life cycle. Project team members don't need to be co-located, although the risks associated with this must be managed carefully. Where large-scale design or analysis is required, or the impact of downstream changes to design is very high, this is likely to be a far more suitable approach. Where there are many interfaces and dependencies outside the basic product development, waterfall projects tend to have the tools to model and manage these. Some cons for waterfall are many organizations and people don't find defining requirements upfront easy to do, especially early in some types of projects. The assumptions upon which early stage plans are based may be very flawed and too often are taken as being based on certainty. Communication can be a far higher risk, especially when there is limited early review of outputs and deliverables, or when one-way methods of communication are used to convey requirements. Risk is, in general, can be far higher with waterfall. For example, as the scope for invalid assumptions is unlimited, If you add this to the high cost of making changes later in a waterfall project, it is easy to see why some are very expensive, over budget, and late. Too often, assurance of products being fit for purpose is demonstrated very late in the waterfall projects. Now, let me introduce you to our panel. Gary Woods, PMP, has been at ODOT for 6 years. He is a senior project manager at ODOT and manages IT, such as software development, COTS, and infrastructure projects at ODOT. His top agile tip is make sure that everybody on the project understands their role, the expectations of the role, and timeframes when they will be required to contribute to the project. Next, Palm Core, PMI, PBA, has been at Department of Corrections for 7 years. She is Deputy CIO and is responsible for the IT PMO team at Department of Corrections. She also manages IT projects at Corrections. Her top agile tip is it's doable, user-friendly, engaging, and fun. Next, Bethany Ford, PMP, has been at Oregon Department of Human Services, Oregon Health Authority, Office of Information Services for 1 year. She is a senior project manager for project solutions and manages IT projects at OHA. Her top agile tip is make a conscious effort to use more visual requirements as you manage agile projects. Next is Robert J. Devassi, PE, PMP, who has been at Oregon Department of Transportation for 4.5 years and in the transportation industry, both public and private, for 28 years. He manages mostly waterfall roadway and transportation projects at ODOT. His top agile tip is be flexible. Barbara Laughlin has been at Oregon Health Authority for 2.5 years. She is a senior technical project manager and manages mostly software development and vendor developed projects at OHA. Her top agile tip is trust and teamwork are key to successful agile projects. And Dan Feder has been at Oregon Health Authority Office of Information Services for 2 years. He is a business systems analyst and manages the following projects at OHA OIS: Get Vaccinated Oregon, Benefit Management System, and Laboratory Information Management System. His top agile tip is get heavy business engagement and responsibility that translates into specific user stories that includes user acceptance and do it more at the beginning of the project rather than at the middle. Now we'll go on to our discussion points. We're going to ask panel members questions regarding Agile and Waterfall project management methodologies and ask that they raise their hand, and Alan will call on them to present an answer to the discussion points. If no one raises their hand, Alan will pick someone from the group. Okay, first item up for discussion is Waterfall and Agile are different project management methodologies. What is your process to determine what methodology to use? And do you have a quick checklist or do you excuse me, or do you thoroughly contemplate and act?
And Gary Woods has raised his hand. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you. I work. You just went through a bunch of people there. For everybody who doesn't know me, I work at ODOT and I'm in IT. When I start a project, I start meeting with stakeholders, and during that process, I do a feel out for how much time I'm able to get from the stakeholders, because that really determines a lot of what agile you can use within your projects. An example of this would be if I'm getting the feedback that there's going to be almost no time that they can give to me beyond testing and user stories or some kind of requirements, then I usually slide closer to waterfall. Though I do try to incorporate as many elements as I can that are useful within whatever context I'm dealing with. And no, we don't have any checklists that determine this. So.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have their hand up? Hearing none.
Oh, wait, Barbara
sorry.
Laughlin has her hand up. I'm sorry.
Thank
I
you.
was still on mute.
That's okay. Thank you. So I just wanted to point out that going into the PMUG 7, there's a really good analysis of what projects fit really well with Waterfall and what projects fit really well with Agile. So just in brief summary, if you're working on some new innovation, new territory, then those kinds of projects fit very well into an Agile type environment or project process. If you have very projects that require a lot of regulatory oversight, are very high risk, have safety requirements, those kinds of projects often fit better in the predictive or more waterfall approach. On the other hand, if you have the ability to break your project down into valuable sets of deliverables, so you can deliver one piece and then deliver a second piece and a third piece, then those fit well into an Agile type environment. So I think that PMBOK 7 has a really good analysis of how they approach that practice.
Thank you, Barb and Gary. Anyone else? And we have plenty of discussion points, so don't feel like you have to respond to each and every one of them.
We have Bob has his hand raised.
Go right ahead, Bob. Thanks.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to mention, since this topic is about taking a lot of these waterfall projects and using Agile within it, and I think the key is to get buy-off, to make sure upper management is on board and the team members are also on board early in the project stage to use Agile and use some of the Agile approaches with as we move from a waterfall approach to an Agile. So as I think most of us know, Agile is used a lot within the IT department, but I do a lot of transportation with ODOT projects where it is mostly waterfall. So if there are opportunities to use Agile within a waterfall project, then getting buy-off early on and finding a project that you can find success on first. You hate to use something with these new approaches on a project and then it fails, it doesn't work out. So getting buy-off early, getting team members on board, it does improve quite a bit of communication because there's a back and forth process and storytelling. A lot of the waterfall projects I do, we try to, as we look at deliverables later on, is we try to include construction and even contractors to be involved early on. And so we get feedback early in the project and we try to make adjustments within design sooner than later, and so that way it does improve the deliverables. But it is trying to get buy-off early, and you're adjusting to something that a lot of people are not familiar with. As I think a lot of IT do a lot more Agile projects than projects that I do, which is mostly design and horizontal construction. Hopefully that helps.
Yes, those are all great points. We'll go ahead and move on to the next discussion point. How do you train your product owners or users?
We have Parmcore, if I pardon my pronunciation, has their hand raised.
Yes. So at DOC, we have kind of like guides or the reference guides or handouts for the users. So anytime we do a project with the Agile, the very first meeting is dedicated just to set those expectations and familiarize everyone that what Agile is and what to expect and how many meetings would be there, including the sprint and scrums. So that's the approach usually we take to train the users. And of course, the product owners, throughout the project, they can always ask the questions to the Scrum Master or the IT project manager as needed.
Thank you, Parm. Anyone else?
Gary Woods has his hand raised.
Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. Okay. One of the biggest problems that we have is that while Agile and Scrum, and Lean, these all become buzzwords, but they're not heavily understood by the product owners. So a lot of what I'll do at the beginning is to let them know what they're signing up for, really. And it's more truth in advertising as far as I'm concerned. So what I'm talking about is, let's take Scrum. In the Scrum scenario, the project manager becomes the Scrum master, and a lot of the duties for the that the project manager would maintain within a waterfall project actually go to the product owner. And this is kind of shocking to them. Plus, like that they're going to be having to do what they think of as project management duties. But beyond that, it's really about the time commitment from the other side that Agile um, uh, requires, right? You're going to be doing what will feel like on the business side almost constant requirements gathering, testing, authorization for promotion, these kind of things. It's a constant feedback mechanism. Whereas waterfall, we can go, radio silence pretty much for weeks at a time while we, do development work. And so getting them to understand the time commitment on their side is one of the most important things that I do whenever we're talking about potentially using Agile.
Dan Feder, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with Gary, and it's you have to let them know what kind of a heavy commitment it is in terms of time, as well as letting them know that they're the primary person for being responsible for what's going to be developed, and so they really are a product owner, like it sounds. They own it, and so they need to bring that responsibility to the table. And so usually if it's a brand new product owner, there's some fear associated with that. And so there's also a little bit of an explanation that it's on the job training. And so the first few cycles that you go through, sprints and whatnot, they're learning how to create user stories and stuff like that. And they're learning how the development team is going to work with that. But because they've got the time commitment and they're working so closely, a rhythm starts to form, and the rhythms aren't the same for every product owner and every development team, but they develop that, and through that you build trust. So a lot of training a product owner is really them just being prepared for what they need to come into, but the skill set that they're going to have, they really learn as part of the project starts to move through. It's an on-the-job training kind of thing. The other thing that I usually make implicit in this space is that the product owner is not expected to become technical. They will speak in terms of business speak. It's up to the development team to convert that into technical designs, technical requirements, and stuff like that. So one of the things that's happening is the product owners are not being trained in IT. They're just being trained in how to create good user stories in the business sense so that those can be consumed by the development team.
Great. Anyone else?
That's it for this one.
Thank you. Next is tips and tricks on using Agile for implementation, making the product beneficial.
Oh, let me go back to people. And we have Barbara has her hand raised.
Hi, I will
Barb.
take this on. Sure. So one of the things that I think is very useful about Agile, I mentioned earlier when looking at the different ways of assessing a project to see if it can be Agile, and that's if you can build a roadmap of releases. So I think one of the things I've seen that's really helpful is being able to build that roadmap. So you're chunking the work, if you think of it, into a product that you can release and the business can find useful early in the project. That builds confidence in the process, it builds confidence in the team, and it builds that relationship between the business and the team that's delivering the solution. So in my view, that roadmap that helps you lay out the project at a high level and identify those releases is a key to making a successful Agile project.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Anyone else?
And we have Bethany Ford has a hand raised.
Hi, and just to trail on to what Barb said there, I think, and somebody had this as their tip for Agile in general, is to be flexible, especially as project managers. It's not great if we get rigid in one format of the way things are done. So there's going to be times on an Agile project where, you have this waterfall aspect of your implementation and you have to fit it in somewhere. And sometimes that means, being flexible and bending a little bit in your methodology just to, make the product beneficial and reach that target end date. So flexibility is definitely key. Thank you.
Thank you.
And no hands are raised right now.
Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next subject. How does Agile work with strict state regulatory requirements?
And Parm has her hand raised first, followed by Gary.
Great, thank you.
Actually, it's the other way, but that's all right.
So, yeah, I think I'll kind of like piggyback on what Bethany just said. Be flexible, right? So, state regulatory, we already have a lot of rules and regulations that we have to follow from the initiation to the implementation of any. So that definitely we have to keep in mind, being flexible and also be mindful of all the other things that needs to happen for like Agile in private sector is way different than Agile in government sector. That everything, all the other approvals that needs to be in place for Agile to work and the implementations to work. So that's like flexibility, I think is the key. And then also the cultural, kind of like each organization, each agency has some cultural boundaries or limitations or expectations from the users, from the type of work the agency does. So keeping that in mind, that worked, Agile has to be adopted by the users. So that's it. Thank you.
And go ahead, Gary.
Thank you. So this is an interesting one because what I find a lot in even trying to push more toward Agile away from Waterfall is that the paperwork is not designed for it. and the regulatory oversight. And I'm talking about the managers and all the way through to EIS. And they're just it's not something that it's easy to explain on paper necessarily how to get from point A to point Z. And I find that is one of my biggest hurdles. And when you can crack that nut, things seem to go pretty smoothly. But for me, it's the paperwork and making the project look like what it's going to look like without having done all the requirements gathering at the beginning, and and not sure how long the thing's going to take, because that's one of the things with Agile. You work with gathering requirements as you go, and user stories and so on and so forth. So it's really that hurdle is dealing with getting my paperwork through that. And we're talking about the charter, we're talking about even the schedule, and these type of things. Getting those through is difficult. But if you can manage to get people on board with what your story of how the project's going to go, things usually smooth out. But yeah, thank you.
And Robert has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. I mean, it depends on the regulatory requirements. I mean, to me, I'm thinking funding is probably at least for horizontal construction, is we have to do the design, and then we authorize the construction funding, and so it's different stages there. But as for Agile, I mean, it all comes down to the approach, and how your team does everything in the middle from start to finish. And sometimes that looks at, like, the image I put in the chat is you're just doing short, someone mentioned this already, like short chunks of the thought process, but you're involving the customer sooner than giving them something later, and hoping that it meets all the requirements and we have a quality product. So it all depends on what those regulations are. And we have talked a little bit about flexibility. So it comes down to those requirements too. Are they flexible enough to be able to make adjustments within design or within the development of the product, to come up with something that works better at the end? So it's a lot of communication, and being flexible. So yeah, it goes both ways, both with the project team, but also the owner. The owner needs to be as well flexible if they want to use an approach that shows and can work for that particular project, to save time and to save money.
All right, Robert's next.
Okay.
And all hands are down.
All right, thank you. Next, what are the biggest Agile related challenges within your organization?
And Bethany just raised her hand. Go ahead, Bethany.
And this will kind of talk about the topic we just got off of. In talking about the different, regulatory requirements we have when it comes to working with EIS, there are parts that when we get to like a stage gate 2 aspect of the project where we need to provide them with schedule. And in that schedule, it's a detailed work breakdown structure with tasks and level of effort, resource names, resource allocation, duration, dependencies. And depending on the vendor that has been possibly selected for the effort, because on my side, we work a lot with our DDI vendors, you may not have that work breakdown structure. And so it gets a little complicated and challenging in trying to figure out how you put together a schedule that's waterfall in nature to get it past EIS approval when you're working with a vendor that doesn't do waterfall. So we've run into this a few times. An example of how we addressed it in one situation is we broke the project into 2 phases. In phase 1, it was more of a waterfall planning approach where almost 2 years were spent plotting out what this project would look like Phase 2 then was the actual beginning of the implementation. And that while that works, you have to be careful about, over the course of 2 years of doing that waterfall planning, people change, your resources change, and you might, be with a different team by the time you do implementation. So it does definitely come with its challenges to getting through the regulatory checkoffs and lists. Thank you.
Okay, Robert, you're next.
Yes, a lot of good information here. I think for me, it's just the training too is also something that's a big challenge. A lot of like what I do, Agile's not as common. It's more waterfall and we, from start to finish. So having that training on the different methods that Amy mentioned earlier in the presentation, having that training and having people certified in that training will help get people familiar with some of the pros and cons and be able to look at during the business case phase is to see, all right, is this project something that is more agile than waterfall, or is it a hybrid? So having the training, getting the training out gives people the options to look at things a little differently. And then same with having training for the owners too. And as bringing them in and like we mentioned before, working together and having the knowledge to do it right.
And Dan, you're next.
Yeah, I've found that it's very hard to get the correct business engagement and commitment and responsibility. I haven't been with the state for very long. I've only been with a couple years, but one of the things that I've seen is that a lot of managers have a hard time delegating the responsibility down, but they don't have the time to be that involved. So they tend to select a subordinate to be involved, but they don't have the responsibility. So just not getting the correct business engagement, and typically it's to some of those managers, they really just need to be able to delegate and trust the people that they're delegating to do that, and the people that are delegating need to be able to that delegated to need to be able to take full responsibility of that work. And so I've noticed an issue with that engagement outside of the state. It's not just a problem with the state. Outside of the state, getting business engagement can be very difficult. And it's one of the big challenges because most of the time, the people that are assigned to be the business owners have a day job that takes up all their time. So the time needed for them to be part of the project as a business owner is not their job, their day job isn't alleviated enough to give them the time to do that. So that's been a challenge is getting the correct engagement from the business.
Understood. Thank you. Anyone else?
All hands are down.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next. Please share about how your agencies translate waterfall style portfolio planning into agile execution.
And Gary, go ahead.
Thank you. So okay, this is going to sound a little weird, but what I do is I create sequential waterfalls. And it's using the agile methodology, right? Which you're chunking up what the project is into parts. And but they tend to be bigger than the 2, 3, 4 week sprints. They usually tend to be closer to 6 to 8 week chunks. Which, but sorry, but within those, we have all of the pieces except for the requirements gathering. Getting the requirements gathering in those chunks becomes really problematic. So what we do is we pull out the requirements gathering and put it at the beginning, like a waterfall project, and then chunk the project up into phases or whatever you want to, units, however you want to call it. And then run those to conclusion before starting the next one. So that's kind of how we do it. Well, how I'm doing it in my projects at ODOT.
Great, thank you. Harm, do you have anything to share on this since you're head of your PMO team?
No, actually, that's exactly what we are doing too.
Okay.
Because, yeah, there is no other way, right? Because of the limited resources and the limited kind of like sometimes time and the documentation, as I stated in my previous answer related to the regulatory, requirements. We have to plan the things waterfall and then kind of like just chunk it down as kind of like the agile. But it's not the full implementation either that way, because then we have to wait depending on the type of project. So the development and testing is happening in the agile style, but the implementation is happening as waterfall. So
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have their hand up?
No one else has their hand up.
Great, thank you all so much. Next is, what are some strategies you use to effectively manage dependencies across Agile projects?
Barbara, go ahead.
Sure, I can talk about a couple. One that I've used at another place that I was at, where you're using what we call Scrum of Scrums. So basically, you would have the Scrum Masters come together and we would share across projects where work was needed from a different Agile team. So for example, if we had a database team that was more support, and we had an infrastructure team that, provided the access maybe to different systems. So you would talk during that Scrum of Scrum to say, hey, database team, in my upcoming sprint in 3 weeks, I'm going to need this work done. And so that's where then they would get their story on their board to get the work done so that it's ready when I need that work. So that's one way I've done it. One of the ways we are doing it here at the state is we've got 2 different teams, and they're often dependent on each other. So there's a couple of ways we're handling it. One is that we're using a limited set of tasks in one board to define the dependencies, and then we're actually doing the work in the other project within ADOS. Another way that we tried to do it but didn't work so well was to create a cross-project query that had the dependencies defined. That didn't work so well because we didn't want to give our vendor access to that second project, if you will, in ADOS.
Thank you.
Harm, you're next.
Yeah, it's slightly different at DOC. We have a governance committee who usually help with the prioritizations of the project, which indeed kind of like roll into at the resources level. So that's how the prioritization is so there are no competing projects out. Like if there are competing projects, then the resources are based off that prioritization method that's driven by that governance committee. And the factors that can impact those decisions are the mandates or anything that comes out of DOJ or legislative sessions and all those fun stuff. So
Dan
Great,
is next.
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer for managing dependencies across Agile products since I've been working with the state. But prior to working with the state, the type of Agile that we had implemented was SAFE, which is Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprises. And they had a complete process for dealing with dependencies through a delivery train So there are answers to doing this, but those answers haven't completely been implemented in the state. So just to say, there are strategies out there that are very effective, but they haven't been adopted by the state yet.
Thank
And
you.
that's it for the hands.
Okay. Please speak about how you report on funded projects when Agile teams report progress and story points.
Gary.
Yeah, hi. So this is kind of I've only worked in a couple places within state government, but I have worked in federal government too. But I will say that if you can get the people who are overseeing your project, and whether that's a board, whether that's managers, a couple of managers, EIS, whoever it is, if you can get them to focus on the top line, here's the number, right? The whether that's in time or whether it's the funding on the projects, the amount of cash we have to spend, and then deal with it in terms of that, it seems to help a lot. Most of the time, if you can get through whatever schedule you created that incorporates agile methodologies, if you can get it through the process, I find that this actually goes reasonably easily, because we're just reporting how much we've spent and or how much time we've used, right? And so most people don't care about the nuts and bolts of the project after you can get past those, regulatory oversight pieces. But honestly, as long as you're staying within budget, plus or minus 10%, you're staying within time plus or minus 10%, and the project's getting done to the business satisfaction, that's really how easy it is for us when it comes to this, to the reporting on the funding of the project. And I think that's what we're talking about here, but I could be wrong. But we don't have any further regulatory pieces besides that, because our funding is a lot of our funding actually comes from the federal government, and we don't have to report back on that as long as we, other than line items. So there you go.
Thank you.
And there are no more raised hands.
Okay.
Oh wait, Barbara just popped in and out.
Go for it, Barb.
Yeah, I was going to say, so that's a little bit of a challenge, right? So what I've seen is that it's really an education for your audience. So the way I like to do it is you have your roadmap that says this is what we're planning to do, and it's sort of high level across the sprints or maybe across the release, depending on how you have that set up. So you are showing that the work is progressing and not necessarily, and we keep track of how much time is charged to the project as well. So we see how that works, but the way we show progress is where we're progressing on that roadmap. So, if you are where you should be, just like you would in your Microsoft project, if you are where you should be, then you know where you're, what the plan is. And then as you move along, you should be able to see that, that progress on your on your plan.
Great. Thank you.
And that's it for the hands.
Okay. All right. Final question. What is one or two things you would pass on to folks who may be viewing this presentation about managing agile projects within the state? What are your potholes?
And Gary followed by Parm.
Sorry, just to say it again, it's the paperwork, the oversight, like trying to push agile methodologies into what appears to be a waterfall framework that people understand in the paperwork, in the charter, and the schedule, and the project plan, and all of that. So that's really my number one pothole.
Go ahead, Barb.
For me, I think the biggest thing, anytime you're doing Agile with the people who have not done it before, give them a reminder to forget everything they read about it online. It's not like, you know, because we are state, we are different, and there are tons and tons of definitions out there for Agile. It doesn't, I mean, like some talk about 1 week Scrum, some talk about 2 weeks Scrum, 4 weeks Scrum. It's whatever is the most user-friendly based on the type of users and the type of products and the type of projects you're dealing with. It's okay to adopt and make some changes that works for your organization and your team, and it's okay to do that. So allow to have those things as long they're within the acceptable norms of, you know, we are not delaying the project, and you know, and everyone is getting the time because this is on top of their other job, right? So it's okay to allow those kind of changes and as a part of adopting the Agile methodology within. So there is no hard and fast rule that it has to be this or that. So that's my only thing that I try to remind every user that it doesn't have to be a 1 week Scrum or 1 week sprint or 2 weeks. If 4 weeks is what works, perfect, as long as it works.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Hearing none, we'll just go to the next slide, which
I'm
is.
sorry. I
Oh.
was muted. There was Robert posted something in the chat, and then Dan Feder had his hand raised.
I was just going to say that a lot of people have different ideas about Agile. So one of the things is, even if everybody's on board, making sure that you have a conversation and find out where your definitions are the same and where they're different, so that when you're talking about things, you know, you're talking apples to apples. And Agile is a paradigm shift, so it's not going to directly translate to everything in Waterfall. So sometimes you have to go a level up to find out what people are wanting. And so the definitions don't necessarily translate 1-to-1, but you can usually satisfy everyone's needs as long as you find out what they really need.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and go on to our next slide. Here are some resources where you can learn more about Agile and Waterfall project management approaches. Next questions. Does anyone have their hands raised?
No one has their hands raised at this point, but
Okay,
I'm sure they'll still have questions at about 5:30 this afternoon.
I'm sure.
Shai Gondola has raised their hand.
Gundi, go
Thank-
ahead.
Thank you. I didn't know if it was time for anybody to just jump in and ask questions.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, I want to go back to the presentation you gave earlier, or one of the earlier presentation slides with the pros and cons. And it was talking about requirements. And so my question there is, I was assuming the way it was phrased, that the requirements may be elaborated as you go along. So in that case, how do you, excuse me, how do you use that or work with that when you have, for example, a DDI, an implementation contractor, and you need to, have this all laid out in the statement of work? Yeah, exactly there. So how do you work that with a contractor, with establishing your contract when you don't have your requirements fully laid out and you don't know the cost?
Can
And Gary has
someone?
his hands raised to potentially answer that.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So when we've done this successfully, and I'm gonna be honest, there haven't been a lot of times where it was done successfully here, but when we have, what we've done is we have made the requirements gathering part of the contract. And that's absolutely true that, it does depend on what type of contract you have. But we want deliverable based because, most that's what we push for mostly in state government. But if you put in that you're going to do, let's say 4-week sprints, right? And you're going to have there's a requirements gathering within the first 3 or 4 days and so on and so forth. And then what you can do is you can determine how many sprints you think you would need to, it's all guesstimation at that point, but how many sprints you think you would need to be able to do your project in total. Add, depending upon the size of the project, add 1 or 2, and that is the number of sprints that you're going to be contracting for, and then add the potential to do 3 or 4 others depending upon the state's needs at that point. That's what I've seen work. And I'm going to say it didn't work perfectly either, but it allowed for flexibility on our side, on the state side. Now, please hit me hard if you've heard something you didn't agree with.
No, this is Robert. That was good. I mean, the only point I was going to make was the type of contract. So, I mean, you could have time and material, and your scope could be very loose and flexible, where you could have a very tight scope, which would be fixed price, or you can have in between kind of a cost reimbursable. So, I mean, it depends on how much scope you want to start with. That gives you the flexibility, because as you develop that scope within a project, you're going to start finding requirements that are needed. And so it depends on the risk level, and how you go about it. I put just a simple graph that most of you are probably familiar with on risk versus contract type. So it all depends on who wants to take on the risk.
And Tiffany asked Gary, how have lessons learned helped? And Gary has his hand raised.
Yeah, I was just raising it to answer that question. Sadly, lessons learned have not helped hardly at all. And there's a very particular reason for this. It's because as the project managers where I sit, we were in a matrixed organization. We moved to a matrixed organization at ODOT. And I'm talking specifically about the IT. So I'm being very, very specific on that side. And the problem with that is that I don't work with the same people 2 times in a row. I'm constantly bouncing around the agency. I do internal stuff for the IT departments, for IS and and SAIT and stuff like that. And I do development projects for business, development projects for internals. And so really, lessons learned would probably help if I were with the same group and doing and doing similar things over and over and over. But because of the way that my work is structured, it doesn't seem to help me at all. It doesn't seem to help my projects much. I learn things from it. and I try to implement them as I go through. But generally speaking, lessons learned, they don't help with the getting the agile methodology across, or the time commitment, or even a base a pretty decent understanding of the agile methodology, right? So that's my experience with them. I use them still because, well, we're required to, but generally I think they're good because I think it solves things um, that I'm not aware of in future projects, and like I'm not aware that this is really a problem, but if we do a lessons learned, then we're all made aware of it, and so maybe it becomes less in the next project. But when it comes to the agile stuff, doesn't seem to help me out at all. So sorry.
There's a question in the chat. Is there an ODOT or global lessons learned repository? Oh, and Robert replied, not yet. We're hoping our PMO will have one soon.
Great. Are there any more questions? Goody.
Undisha has her hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, me again. So not only as agencies will have to learn to shift from waterfall to agile, but so does our oversight body. And so I'm curious, what are some of the difficulties that you may have encountered with that when it comes to our oversight bodies?
And Gary has his hand raised.
This is one of the reasons why I joined this panel right here, the oversight bodies. Really, what we're talking about, like committee structures that do oversight. Usually I can get those on board with some quick learning sessions and that kind of thing. Managers, a little bit, sometimes they're part of that process, but I can usually get managers on board. The real sticking point is EIS. EIS does not like to see agile methodologies because, and it actually makes a bit of sense for them, because they cannot evaluate the project, because all they get is paperwork, right? They can't evaluate the project paperwork as easily with an agile methodology as they can with a waterfall methodology. The waterfall methodology, you do all your requirements gathering up front, right? You do all your planning, and it's very sequential in that aspect, where and there's actually within the chat, there's that Robert put it in. It's like the colored waterfall versus agile. Basically, you're just doing you're doing multiple things over and over and over and over and over. But the thing is, you're doing all the things. So, trying to put in what your end state in the paperwork is going to be, much less how you're going to get there with an agile methodology, becomes problematic. And getting it to them in a fashion that EIS will understand. And so that's really what the big problem for us is whenever we go agile, is getting EIS to sign off on something. That's why you heard me earlier say that I go this weird sort of sequential waterfall and expand out, the sprints into phases, because that seems to be, even if we do the requirements gathering in those big chunks and call them phases, that seems to be something that EIS can understand and can get behind and sign off on. So thank you.
Next, we have Barbara, followed by Parm.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think even before EIS, we've got to get our contracts teams to support Agile. And that's a real big trust issue for all companies, not just for the state, to recognize that what Agile means is it says, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars, and then we're going to work together to figure out exactly what we're going to release, right? So I think that's one of the starting points. One of the things that we're doing, and I work on mostly vendor developed solutions for the state. What we are doing is doing sort of that waterfall upfront planning And then when we get down to actually the execution part of the project, that's where we go Agile. So then we can take all those requirements that have been laid out. We can say, okay, these are the first 6 we're going to work on, and then we can release those into a special release, if you will. So we have a little flexibility then within the project. And so far, EIS has been along for the ride on that. I understand it's not truly Agile, but it's only a piece of it that becomes Agile, but it does make it workable within the state and within the bounds of the EIS requirements.
Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, so
Go
I
ahead,
think,
Barb. Yeah.
Thank you. My experience with EIS, and I think they recognize this too, they are not made up for Agile work. The whole stage gate is not designed for Agile work. And I think that's where they are also trying to find out the way to kind of like do it differently. So far at DOC, all the success any related to Agile has for internal projects that we do for the enhancements and things like that. Any stage gate project, I'm waiting for that day when Agile would work there. So, yeah.
Go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, just listening to this brought up one other thing that I've actually done, and it worked once. So I'm going to throw it out there. Is we basically made the project 2 pieces. Okay, and the first one was planning and requirements. Okay, so that's all we were doing was planning and requirements, and then the second piece was the development and testing and implementation. If you do that, right, and there's ways to contract this too. EIS seems to like that a lot better, right? And you're not going to be collecting the requirements in each sprint or whatever it happens to be, but you're doing everything else within that sprint, right? So you're like, here's the work efforts we're doing for this 3 weeks, right? And you do all of that, but it seems to one, it helps with your planning because you now know the requirements, right? So you can say more definitely how many sprints there are going to be to make that happen. But it also seems to bring down the pressure that I get from EIS. Like the one time I did it, it seemed to bring down the pressure. Like, like they're like, oh, okay, we can see what you're doing now, right? And this is why I talk about sequential waterfall, because that's really what that is. It's like, we did all the, the planning and the the requirements gathering up front, and we're really just doing a bunch of development, testing, and implementation work over and over. So it's fakey, I know that, right? But it is a way to deal with these kind of issues that you are having with EIS. Although I will also say what it did do, it created a gap, right? It was a contracting issue. And so, we had the contract, set up for the first one, and we were working on the contract for the second part, but it didn't get in place in time. So we had about a 3.5-month gap between the two, which extended the project, right? So there are downsides to this. It is not in any way a silver bullet. I just wanted you guys, but I did remember that I had done this once. So
Thank you.
Out of curiosity, how long was your planning, like the requirement gathering session lasted?
So this also included all of, like, when we were talking about planning, it includes all of the EIS documents, right? So the ITI and all of those, type of things, the business case and that kind of stuff. So we planned 4.5 months for that, right? For all of that. So we got to do this, we had to have the contract in place first, right? Like so that we could get the contractors in so that we could hit the ground kind of runnings. But take away that contracting piece, it's about 4.5 months of gathering requirements, right? And doing all of the EIS paperwork pieces. And then, like I said, there's about a 3.5-month gap there. And then it was kind of funny because after that, it only took us about 9 months of cycling. to get the project done. So if you think about it in those terms, it wasn't that bad as far as the project goes, right? But it was like it was a lot. I mean, that's another thing you got to think about. If you start doing these things where you're trying to push in agile methodologies and you got to get them through the regulatory framework that we currently have, you're going to be playing games, right? You're going to be, pushing things kind of as far as you can to get them through. And you're not breaking anything, but you're still working, trying to find ways to push agile methodologies into a decidedly waterfall framework on the regulatory side. So it worked. Would I do it again? Man, I'm going to tell you that was a lot of hand holding on a lot of parts. I'm just saying it worked. I'm not saying that it was fun for me per se, but I will say I was very, very happy once we got into the development work, right? Like once we got to there, things kind of smoothed out a bit because my progress reports were much easier to do and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's doable, but again, not the silver bullet at all.
Thank you. I love the enthusiasm. Anyone else?
No hands raised.
Any additional questions? Okay, seeing none. Go ahead and start by closing this panel presentation. I've placed a link to a survey in the chat. We hope that you've enjoyed this panel presentation. I've posted a link to a short survey in the chat that will help us improve future PMUG experiences. You can look for a follow-up email with links to resources, and we'll also be posting some feedback forms, including one you can fill out to nominate yourself or a colleague as a future presenter. And please share with your team members and those who may not be on the PMUG listserv to reach out to chro.trainings@das.or.us if you'd like to be on the PMUG listserv. Again, if you're interested in joining the Project Management Advisory Board or learning more about business analyst processes, visit the OPMAB or BANG websites. Thank you so much, panel members. It's been a great discussion. I look forward to seeing you all again in May. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody. Have a
Bye.
great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.